Well, welcome back. My first guest today is our very own Luke Jones, bringing the heat from up north in parts unknown as usual. Luke, welcome in.
Dennis, what's going on, my friend?
Hey, lots is going on. The heat is up. The Orioles are hot. They just had the first overall pick in the draft, and I watched the draft for the first time in my life. And I understand. Was this the first time it was televised?
No, it's been televised, but the last couple of years they've really tried to make it much more like the NFL draft, more like the NBA draft, where you actually have it on site. They've shifted it from early June to the All-Star break. They're trying to make it more of an event. I think it's always going to be difficult because you just don't have the thirst and interest in college baseball. And certainly, unless you're just a complete YouTube junkie, you're not going to see a whole lot of these high school kids like Jackson Holliday, for example. Right. You'll see some highlights, and there's some, he's played on some USA teams and different things like that. But you're always going to be limited in that way. But I think they did a good job, and really lends itself to you even tuning in, that they had some interest in that. And I think one thing that they did well that they should continue to do is incorporate the former players announcing the picks. I mean, you have the commissioner early on, like you see in every sport, but we saw Rick Dempsey announcing picks for the Orioles. You saw Rick Sutcliffe announcing picks for the Cubs, Raleigh Fingers for the A's. Yeah, that helps. And certainly it'll help having more and more of the prospects there, which, the NFL has dealt with that in recent years. You're not having even some of the very top picks. We didn't have the number 1 overall pick at the draft this year in the NFL. So you'll have some of that. But the more and more you can make this feel like a big event, I think it's just better for the game. And I'd say that for any sport. So definitely exciting times, with the Orioles having won I guess it was 11 of 13 going into the All-Star break, and a 500. And now we'll see what happens over this next week as they play the Yankees and the Rays to really kind of see where they are before the trade deadline. And beyond that, I think the big topic, the big story that'll be on most people's mind here in town is the Ravens starting to report for training camp. And at this time next week, they'll already have some full squad workouts under their belt. So a lot to be excited about here in Baltimore, with the Ravens being the given this time of year, getting going, but certainly the pleasant surprise of the Orioles playing better baseball, much better baseball than we've seen here recently.
Luke, for me, I couldn't really project a high school player to the NFL, right? And I think it's the same thing because of the time that it takes for these high school players to make it to the major league level. So I don't know how somebody can say, well, Jackson Holliday is a better prospect than Drew Jones and vice versa. I guess you're looking at different things. Perhaps Drew's an outfielder, whereas a shortstop theoretically can play any position on the field with the exception of pitcher.
Yeah, and I mean, those are the things that you're kind of going through. I mean, that's the great debate with baseball as far as drafting college players who, generally speaking, will have a higher floor, but generally, when you're drafting a guy who's 21 or 22 already, probably doesn't project to have that same ceiling. Yeah. And high school players, you have that huge ceiling. Jackson Holliday, I mean, the Orioles are hoping this guy's going to be a perennial all-star. I mean, pretty good bloodline. Matt Holliday was a 7-time all-star outfielder back in the day. And but at the same time, we also know that high school players can completely flame out and be a total bust, and he may not make it to the majors. I'm not saying that that's the most likely outcome, but that's just what you deal with. So yeah, you look at the proverbial 5-tool player in baseball. I mean,
somebody said he was 6, and I had to look it up to see what the hell. I mean, all of a sudden, this kid is so good. They've added a 6 tool, which is fun, and he looks forward to hitting a 3-0 fastball. I mean, a 3-0 count. Who doesn't look forward to a 3-0 count as a hitter?
No question. I guess the 6 tool might be probably would be makeup. I mean, that's a term that old school scouts you always heard from.
Luke Jones is a 7-tool journalist. You know what I mean? It's like we're going to add more tools to the bag, but that was a head scratcher. So people get geeked up about these young guys, which is fine. But man, oh man, he's got a long way to go to make it to the majors.
Oh, no question about it. And that's why I wrote at BaltimorePositive.com. If this plan for Mike Elias and the Orioles is one working and will continue to work, Jackson Holliday isn't going to be the guy that is the savior that is helping to make the playoffs. If this is working, they'll already be a playoff team by the time he arrives, which, in a best case scenario, 2 years, most likely scenario, 3 years. If it ends up being slower than that, that's when you start to wonder, okay, is he going to be a great player, or is he just going to be a good player, or is he going to be less than that and an okay player? And then you're a little more disappointed. But it's so much about projection. One reason why this was so notable for the Orioles to do this, and I probably touched on this with you at a couple points, but certainly Nestor and I have talked about this a lot. If you look at how the Orioles have operated under the in the Elias era, it's been much more heavily skewed toward college hitters. The reason why, you have more data on them. You have all these parks with, with the HD cameras. You have all the different, the launch angle and all the different things you can look at as far as hitters, and the pitching side is been a little more volatile, and especially when you're talking about high school pitchers. I mean, the Orioles have only taken one or two over their 4 drafts under Mike Elias. So for them to take a high school shortstop with the first overall pick was notable in that way, just because they've been so college heavy. But it also speaks to them being more established as far as what they do from a baseball ops standpoint, from a scouting standpoint, from a player development standpoint. And look, there are no guarantees. I mean, we talk about this every April and May, Dennis, even with the NFL draft.
Sure.
There are guys that have been taken 1-1 who everyone thought was going to be a slam dunk, at least Pro Bowl player.
Yeah.
And they're not. And they're not even close to that. So, and it's not even a case of, well, Team A was really stupid, although that can certainly be the case, explaining it at times. But other times, there are consensus guys that, for whatever reason, don't pan out. So if you have that in football or basketball, where, basketball, I guess maybe not the best example, because some guys do, go to Europe, or they play in the G League for a year now and don't go to college. But with football, you have that college body of work to go off of, and you still don't have a 100% success rate at the very top of the board. Well, that speaks to where the Orioles are here. But going back to my point I was trying to make, and then I got a little off track here, but the Orioles, if this is all working, Jackson Holliday and any other players they get out of this draft, and in a best case scenario, maybe you get a few others that end up being major leaguers for you. I mean, it's a high failure rate, very high failure rate, but the idea will be they're augmenting and sustaining what's already happening in Baltimore at that point in 2024, 25, 26 moving forward. If this is a case where they have to wait on Jackson Holliday to become a playoff team, well, then things have not gone well. And, we're talking about, whether it's Adley Rutschman not being, the savior they thought he would be, or Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall not being the starting pitchers they're going to need them to be. So that's what's exciting for me. That was exciting about this 1-1 pick compared to Rutschman 3 years ago, where there was no light at the end of the tunnel then. That was a case of Adley needs to work out. They don't have another choice. I mean, this guy's the face of the rebuild. He's the savior for the franchise. Like all the different superlatives and hype descriptions you want to throw out there. They needed him to be that. Not to say that if Jackson Holliday doesn't pan out, that's good or that's okay, because it's not, because you don't want to whiff on 1-1. But we're at a point now where they have built up the farm system enough. You hope the financial commitment will be coming from ownership to then supplement, augment, add some established talent, hopefully starting this offseason, maybe at the trade deadline, if the opportunity presents itself. But this draft is much more, for me, envisioning, all right, is this going to be a case where the Orioles have a couple playoff teams, but they're still not quite able to get over the hump? And then, boy, Jackson Holliday comes and he's going to be one of their 2 best players, or their absolute best player then moving forward. A real simplistic example, Dennis, and it's not a perfect, it's just an analogy, would be the Orioles came up just short in 1979. They lost in 7 games to the Pirates, and then, well, Cal Ripken arrives a few years later and he's MVP of the league, and they won the World Series in '83. So you're hoping Jackson Holliday could be that kind of an impact player for them, but you're hoping that they're going to have success and a couple playoff teams and be a contender before he arrives. So that's where it's exciting now, because there is that light at the end of the tunnel, as we're seeing now at the major league level, with this being a 500 club and playing better. And, you hope they continue to ascend. They still have work to do. There's no question about that. But that's where you look at this now, where it doesn't feel like the 1-1 pick was desperation this time around, as much as a great opportunity to have something that you think is already getting to be pretty good, and it has a chance to be even better down the line.
Well, we all have to be encouraged by their farm system, right? It seems like they have arguably the best farm team in the league right now, the farm system anyway. growing a bunch of these young players, and that does give hope to the future. The team's competitive. Certainly, they have a much tougher schedule the second half of the year, and it's undeniable that Adley Rutschman has provided them with a spark. He's been a leader out there. He's done a great job, and it's I'm paying attention, and of course I'm a casual bandwagon fan. I'll watch them when they're winning, and right now it's compelling baseball. The storylines are there, and I think they have a very bright future. So I'd like to see them stay on track, and there's no indication that they're not.
Yeah, I mean that's all you can ask for at this point. I mean, when you're talking about a team that had lost 108 plus games in each of the last 3 full 162 game schedules, I mean, what are you really expecting? I mean, they're not going to go from 110 losses to suddenly winning 95 games, but what you have seen is market improvement, not just and this goes for what I thought at the beginning of the season. I mean, I thought I was being overly optimistic, thinking they were going to avoid 100 losses. I think I picked them to go 65 and 97. I mean, and now that's looking like, okay, that was overly pessimistic. But that old, I guess you have to walk before you have to crawl before you can walk before you can run. Even though it's not always perfect incremental, that steady incremental improvement, but you're not going to go from absolutely terrible to great overnight. What we're seeing is they're going from where they've been the last few years, which was terrible, and now they're much more competitive. And even before this winning streak, you were seeing them be more competitive on a nightly basis. The eyeball test, it was showing up more there. But again, the end goal is not to be 46 and 46 at the All-Star break. The end goal is to be a playoff team and a World Series contender, and hoping you can win a championship for the first time since 1983. So will that be this year? No. I mean, if you ask me, I think what would be great for them would be if they can hang in this long enough that they're playing games that have some level of meaning in September, and they can be spoiler. At the very least, be a spoiler and be hanging around and have a chance that it's interesting into the month of September. For me, then that means this offseason, you're going for it. It doesn't mean you're increasing your payroll to $200 million overnight. I don't know how high their payroll will ultimately go, but you're hoping they will look and see, if there's a free agent or two out there, if there's a trade to be made that they can augment their roster. You don't want to blow up your farm system doing it, but if there's an opportunity to spend a little money and bring someone in that fills a role that you don't necessarily have a young guy for right now, then do it. I want to see that. It's not a switch as much as probably a dial in that way, in terms of spending a little more, making some more moves for the major league roster. And then with that in mind, my thought is you're trying to make the playoffs next year. They won't be a favorite, certainly not in the AL East at this point in time, but that's what the goal and the objective should be. And that's why I'm going to be very interested to see what this offseason looks like for them, because, to say the least, it's been very methodical on that end. When Jordan Lyles is your biggest signing, and, that's been deliberate. And Mike Elias did not lie about that when he came in. He flat out said this is going to be a several year process. So, it's not a case of him being dishonest. It's just been where they are. But now, as you are seeing young guys, and more young guys are going to be coming, and that's going to be what's interesting too. Who else arrives from AAA in the second half of the season that could give them a little bit of a lift this year? But for me, it's more about getting their feet wet, and then they can hit the ground running next year. So that's really where we are. And then for me, what does the offseason look like? Is it more methodical and you're kind of being cheap, for lack of a better term? And you're saying, okay, we have all these young guys, but can you bring in an extra pitcher? Can you bring in a role player that fits a certain spot that's more of a veteran that can give you some clubhouse leadership as well? Can you do some of those things in addition to counting on these young guys to take the next step? And if you do that, then I think you have a team next year that could be very interesting and be a very serious, at the very least, wild card contender. A team that's not feeling as much of a Cinderella as it is right now, as much as, hey, this is a team on the come and ascending and getting better and better. So, all those different things. We'll see how it plays out here over these last 2.5 months of the regular season, and hopefully some interesting baseball. Again, I'm not expecting them to make it as a wild card by any stretch, but at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and say that these guys can't continue to play good baseball. And if they do that, and you look around at rest of this division, I mean, Red Sox just lost Chris Sale. The Blue Jays just fired their manager. The Rays have dealt with a slew of injuries. And that's not to say that the Orioles are better than those teams, but all those teams are dealing with that adversity. If the Orioles can avoid those types of injuries and those elements and have a little bit of luck and a few guys play a little bit better than they did over the second half of the season, because there's some guys who didn't have great first halves, established players who just had okay first halves. If you can get to some of those guys getting hot, some of your young players continuing to improve, then who knows? Maybe we are talking about a wild card race in the third week of September, which, my goodness, considering where they've been the last few years, it's all you can ask for at this point in the rebuild. And then, like I said, for me, what's really going to be key is looking at what this offseason looks like and just how active they are in trying to improve that major league roster. Kind of that combination of bringing in, a veteran or two, and also making sure you still have those opportunities there for these young guys to come up and seize the moment, because they are highly touted. To your point, having, if not the best farm system, because Adley Rutschman's graduated now, so maybe it's not the best, but certainly up there amongst the very best still.
Well, it's very hard to believe, Luke. It's been 39 years since the Orioles won a championship. Glad you brought that to the forefront. But with that said, let's switch gears and, of course, talk of some Ravens camp. Rookies have reported. Devon Williams was MIA. I had some high hopes for him, 6'5" kid out of Oregon. I watched him there. I know he was a transfer, had some issues, but certainly had an opportunity. And this is not how you want to start your training camp as a rookie.
Yeah. I mean, just kind of weird. I mean, we haven't heard too much about it, but reserve did not report list. I mean, is there a personal matter? Is there something going on there that we're not aware of? But he didn't show up. And, I think what's unfortunate about that is, of their rookie wide receivers during the spring, and again, it's the spring, I talk about this all the time, don't make too much out of practices and helmets and shorts, but, he was probably among those undrafted rookies, the guy that flashed the most this spring. So maybe they can still work something out here. It doesn't mean that he's gone per se. They didn't release him, but when reserve did not report, that's where you do wonder what's going on there. Rookie running back Ricky Person, a roster exemption, left the squad. That does sound like someone who, more so showed up and said, I don't think I'm going to pursue this, which, long shot anyway, not someone that was going to be on the radar most likely. And then the other being Benjamin Victor, who was on the practice squad last year, non-football injury list. Have not heard for sure, Dennis, but keep in mind, for anyone who fails the conditioning test, the non-football injury list is where they are placed. I don't know if that's the case for Victor. Right. For all we know, he could have hurt himself training or at some point over the last few weeks, which that would be technically a non-football injury. But, you hope that's something that's, just something that's the early days of camp. As I remind everyone, and I wrote this at BaltimorePositive.com in my latest 12 Ravens thoughts, this is the time of year you'll hear about guys being placed on PUP. You'll hear about guys being placed on non-football injury. Keep in mind, at this stage, that doesn't have any relevance to the regular season. Now, for someone like David Ajabo, placed on non-football injury, do not expect to see him practicing this summer. He's the guy that, out of all their names coming back from injury, he's the one that probably is the strongest candidate to potentially start the year on non-football injury, which, that's when you get into missing the first 6 games. And not saying he will, just saying out of all their different players coming back from injuries, he's the guy, of course, who suffered his injury at his pro day back in March. So, longer timetable for him. But, 'tis the season for PUP and overreaction to conditioning tests and all that different stuff that we make a big deal out of. And in most cases, 99% of the time, it's forgotten about a few weeks down the road. So, you hope to see everyone come into camp in shape and healthy and ready to go as much as possible. But you do know there's usually at least a couple hiccups. And certainly for this Ravens team, the big question is going to be for some of these injured guys, including J.K. Dobbins, who took exception to, what I thought wasn't an overly inflammatory report from Ian Rappaport. And I'll say this much. I don't know his reporting. I don't know Ian particularly well. I've met him a few times, talked to him a few times over the years, but I highly doubt he would go with that reporting on NFL Network if it didn't come from someone either directly in the organization or with direct knowledge of what's going on in the organization, whether it's a coach, whether it's an executive, whoever. And I'll also say this, and John Harbaugh even alluded to this during minicamp. Even said that if you talk to JK, he's ready to go right now, but he's got some work to do still. So that right there shows a big part being an organization, medical staff, training staff, coaches, is you have to protect players from themselves sometimes. And it might be a case of JK may feel he's ready. He might be ready if he absolutely had to go right now, but they might be saying no. You had an ACL, there was some other damage here. Yeah, you've had 11 months, but we're going to take this slow. And we think you'll probably be ready for week 1, but we're not going to take any chances in late July on that. So, and that would be the right way to go. So, I understand his competitive nature, his fire. He's been through, he's the player who has to live with the injury for the last 11 months and being out of the spotlight. And you hear so many players talk about rehab being such a lonely place, because
sure.
Your professional standing is all about what you can do on the field. No one's, everyone's wishing you well for rehab, but no one's paying attention to it, right? I mean, it's, no one even gave 2 thoughts about J.K. Dobbins last October and November. Not that anyone, it wasn't ill will. It was just, hey, he's not available right now. He's not a part of the 2021 equation. So it's a lonely place for these guys. So I can understand the reaction, but I would also say, I saw a lot of fans are quick to side with the player and jump on the reporter. And look, reporters can be wrong. Don't get me wrong. That we can be wrong. We're wrong a lot. But this was a case where, he wasn't saying he won't play week 1. He was just saying, they're going to be really careful here, as they should be in late July. The goal is not for J.K. Dobbins to suit up for the stadium practice. The goal is when he is right and ready to go, for him to be out on the field to look like J.K. Dobbins, not some shell of the player. And I said I did a hit this week on one of the NBC Sports podcasts, and I said that you always want your running back to come back like Adrian Peterson, who just had this miraculous recovery and was amazing. But more often than not, it does tend to be a little more like Saquon Barkley, for example, this past year, where still not totally right. Numbers aren't great. Maybe has some other injuries, and with that in mind, that's where the Ravens want to try to be as careful as they can. So we'll see. Maybe JK is totally right. Maybe he'll be out there the first day and avoid the PUP list. But I tend to think the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle there. Not ruling him out for week 1, but they're going to play it slow here, and we're not going to see him on the very first day. That's what my gut tells me at this point. But our curiosity will be satisfied here soon enough, Dennis.
See, my take was this. I put on my coach's hat or my GM's hat, and I wish that my players, I know they're young, stay off of Twitter. Because I'd like for the Jets to be wondering, is J.K. Dobbins going to be there? Is Gus Edwards going to be there? Is Tyler Beatty going to be the starting running back? So for me, from a strategic standpoint, just say nothing and let it play out the way it's supposed to. I know the young guys, whether it's J.K. or Lamar, they're going to lash out.
Yeah.
But to me, is stay off of social media and don't give the opposition any advantages, any type of an edge. Keep them guessing until the opening kickoff.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, as I wrote in my 12 Ravens thoughts, most recently, tis the season where we're seeing star quarterbacks have beefs with disgruntled former Ravens and whining about Madden ratings and all this different stuff. The long story short, this is the one time the football world has a bit too much time on its hands. And that's obviously going to change here very quickly, and business is about to pick up, which thank goodness we'll actually have some, I won't say real football just yet, Dennis, but some actual, training camp practices, and, we'll have some tangible thoughts and observations as far as, guys coming off of injury, what the rookies are looking like with the pads on, all those different things where, it's a lot of speculation. It's a lot of dreaming, a lot of, just assuming, and this time of year, and look, it's the nature of the offseason. There's nothing wrong with that. But you do get to a point where, the crying over some of these lists and rankings and Madden game ratings and all this, I'm just like, Uncle, can we get out on the field and actually have some real stuff to talk about? How about that?
Speaking of real stuff, Luke, I thought about this this past week. I have a pair of season tickets. I've had them since 1996. They cost me about $1,000 a piece. You know what? It's $2,000 a year. I would pay the same $2,000 a year if they got rid of the 3 preseason games. If they're worried about losing, beverage and food revenue, I'd pay $2,500 for the pair just to avoid the 3 preseason games. College football has it right. They say this is the day when they kick off. There's no scrimmage. They can still have scrimmages. They can go
Yeah.
up to Philadelphia. They can go play the Giants. They can go down to DC and play the Commanders, right? So you can still have some inter-squad scrimmages, controlled scrimmages. But for me, in September, just kick off the regular season and let's go. I wouldn't mind if it was just the Ravens going up to playing the Jets, and that's it with no preseason football. I would welcome that.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's funny. I mean, you think back to 2020 with the pandemic. I mean, there were no preseason games, no joint practices, any of that. And, it was a different season. There's no question about that. But everyone was on the same level playing field, right? It's not as though some teams had preseason games and others didn't. But the reality is, go take a look at the nationally televised preseason games. And look, as much as those games, for the most part, you might watch the first quarter and then you're like, all right, it's one thing watching the Ravens backups. It's another thing watching other teams backups.
I agree.
Yeah. But I hear you from a, if we're just going to talk about it from a football standpoint, the impact it has on the season, the quality of play, I'm guessing there are definitely other ways you could get guys prepared to have a representative start to the season and have a perfectly good, competitive, legitimate season without having those preseason games. But they're not going away. I mean, it's just a reality. But I hear you on that, and I think it's good.
And look at J.K. Dobbins, not to cut you off, but I mean, John Harbaugh had explained, I'm sure, to Steve Bisciotti why J.K. Dobbins was playing against the Commanders.
Sure.
And he gets hurt in a meaningless game. It's horrible.
Yeah, and it is tough. I mean, at the same time, someone would say, in defending John Harbaugh, and look, this isn't a John Harbaugh only thing, of course, and I'm not suggesting that you were saying that, but Marcus Peters and Gus Edwards tore their ACLs in practice. So there's always going to be attrition, and
you got to still answer to the owner, because the owner's going to say, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Is it the turf? Sure. Is it the turf? Is it your? And they did. They looked at everything. They looked at the turf. They looked at the training methods. You have to, because these are the players of his investment, and he wants healthy players and the best for them. So I'm not knocking Harbaugh by any means or the organization. But what I'm saying to you is, preseason games. I don't want to see any starters in preseason game. I just think that should be out the window.
I'll say this much. I don't know this for sure, but based on how they've trended the last few years, which we've seen them play their starters less and less. A few years ago, we started seeing the proverbial all-important third preseason game not become all that important anymore. Of course, now they only do 3 preseason games as opposed to 4. But at this point, I would be very surprised to see any established starters whatsoever. I think you're going to see guys that, certainly rookies, certainly young guys trying to make the roster. I think here's a perfect example where I think you'll see guys left guard. Okay, Tyree Phillips has started games in the league. Ben Powers has started games in the league. Ben Cleveland has started games in the league. You'll see those guys play in the preseason because they're trying to figure out who's going to play left guard. Whether it's one of those 3 or maybe Patrick McCary, throw him in there. But anyone that is going to be a starter, that's not. I think Tyler Linderbaum will get some run, at least a little bit. Although I'm not so sure you'll even see, your higher draft picks play as much as they played in the past. But those rookie or those established veteran starters, I don't think you're going to see them sniff the field. I really don't. So it's kind of funny. I mean, the Ravens are doing this long trip to Arizona to play the Cardinals, and that's going to be a nationally televised preseason game. I don't think anyone of all that terribly high consequence that's a veteran anyway is going to see the field. So that's where you look at this, and going back to your initial point about the preseason games and just your taste for it or lack thereof of an appetite for preseason games. But I'm guessing, and here's another thing, I believe, don't quote me on this exactly, but I believe the statistic was, I don't think the Rams have played their starters now for the last 3 or 4 preseasons.
Okay.
Well, they won the Super Bowl this year. So keeping all those guys out of the preseason clearly didn't hurt them too badly. So, these are all the things that you have to weigh as a head coach, though, and as an organization. I mean, there's a cost benefit to everything you do. theoretically, you could keep everyone healthy by not practicing all summer, but we know how that's going to work out once you get to week 1, right? I mean,
not
there's
too good.
Yeah, so there's always, you are never going to eliminate injuries unless what? You eliminate football, right?
Correct.
So you're always trying to weigh how much is enough work for us to be ready with how much is too much work, or what kind of work that puts us at an added risk for injury. You're never eliminating the risk. I mean, that's just the truth. I remember Tavon Young tearing his ACL in OTAs. I remember Dennis Pitta suffering his unfortunate career-ending third hip injury in the spring of 2017. I mean, there's only so much you can do, but there is something you can do, and that's where you do weigh all these different things. And I was looking at it, Dennis. I mean, everyone knows the Ravens finished first in adjusted games lost this past year. Football Outsiders, their metric for kind of quantifying the injuries rather than just saying, well, we had X number of players on injured reserve, which doesn't tell you a whole lot. But this really, went through, and the Ravens had the highest number of adjusted games lost in their database going back to, I think, 2000 or 2001. So it just really speaks to the historic nature of the, how much they were hammered by injuries. But I also looked, and this is where you take some pause, because we've talked about this. As much as you are hoping everyone comes back and is healthy, and your luck's going to be better. Over the last 5 seasons prior to last year, the team that was first in adjusted games lost, meaning they lost more players to injury and more impact to injury than anyone else in the NFL. The following year, none of those teams were better than 21st. So they were still kind of that hovering in that bottom 10 territory as far as injuries not being good for them. So, hey, new trainer, revamped training methods and training program. I think it's interesting to notice that their initial schedule they put out, the Ravens are going to be practicing in the afternoons rather than the mornings as they had the last couple of years. Is there some sports science evidence that's driving that? And ultimately, they need to be luckier too. Luck, it really goes back to what I just said, as far as you're not going to remove injuries from the game unless you remove the game itself. Injuries it's still a lot of luck that's involved. I mean, broken bones, I'm not sure there's a whole lot you can do to train to prevent those. ACL, are there certain things? Yeah. I mean, you want to have a sound muscle structure and all of that, but these things still happen. And, I mean, some of the most maniacal workers, as far as guys that take the best care of themselves, have gotten hurt over the years. I mean, I remember Jerry Rice getting hurt. And we all know Jerry Rice's legendary workout regiments, that made him the greatest receiver of all time. So, a lot of it is, you try to do as much as you can to try to mitigate that and try to reduce the risk as much as you can. And then it's just a matter of keeping your fingers crossed and going out there and playing. So, we'll see how it plays out. I certainly anticipate the Ravens not being hammered by injuries to that degree. At the same time, it doesn't mean that they're destined to be the healthiest team in the NFL this year either. So we'll just have to see how it all plays out. And hey, that's the ugly part of the beauty of the game, right? I mean, you know that injuries and attrition are a big part of this, and the teams that are generally speaking the healthiest come December and January are the ones that are going to have the best chance to not just make the playoffs, but ultimately do something special in the playoffs. And well chronicled how the Rams, for the most part, so much talk about not having first round picks, but they've hit on late round picks and they stayed healthy last year for the most part. Not perfect, but that's when you have your chance to do some damage come January. And that's where the Ravens are hoping they can be a few months from now, navigating a 17-game season. That's never easy. We know that much.
Absolutely. Great stuff as always, Luke. Please tell us all the great stuff, all the great work you do at WNST Baltimore Positive, your blog, and everything else that you do.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST. You can follow me personally at Baltimore Luke. I'll be back at the ballpark as the Orioles begin the second half. 3-game set against the Yankees, 4-game set against the Rays. I'll be at the ballpark for most of that. But of course, Ravens reporting Veterans Report on the 26th. First full squad workout is this coming Wednesday. So I'll be in Owings Mills just about every day, except for the days that they kick us out and there is no media access, but have plenty of updates, who's on the field, who's practicing, who gets hurt, who looks good, who doesn't look good, as we start to count down to the preseason schedule, even though not going to see Lamar Jackson and those guys most likely in the preseason games. But check out my blog at BaltimorePositive.com. I'll have my 12 Ravens thoughts pretty much on a daily basis, passing on observations, as I mentioned. Have some other stories as well. Still be following the Orioles plenty, as long as they're relevant. I'll be going out and covering Orioles games and tracking their progress. You want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Tech Service, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. If you are, you'll get any updates on any notable Ravens injuries. You hope there aren't any, but we know most likely there will be some at some point. That's just the nature of the beast. Trade deadline activity for the Orioles, any significant roster moves for either the Orioles or the Ravens, any important local sports news sent directly to your mobile device via the WNST Baltimore Positive Tech Service, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. We will have sound from the ballpark as the Orioles kick off the second half of the season. We will have Ravens players and coaches from Owings Mills. Check out all of that at BaltimorePositive.com.
All right, my friend. Thanks so much, as always, for your time and your insight and your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Keep doing great things and stay cool, just like the Ravens rookies at camp. They picked the wrong week to start camp. That's for sure.
No question, Buzz. Need to stay hydrated and have that sunscreen. No question about it. 'Tis the season, but looking forward to it as we get closer and closer to the 2022 season.
All right, sir. Enjoy the rest of your day, rest of your week, and we'll catch up to you in the next few days.
Sounds good, Dennis. Be well.
You too. There he goes, Luke Jones here, 1570 AM WNST. We'll take our next break and come back right after this. Whoops.